So I would like to introduce John Verdi, the curator of this exhibition, for his lecture on Art Without Irony. What we will do, if you have questions, I'll monitor the chat. And if it seems like an appropriate moment, John will stick in a conversation. Otherwise, we'll wait until the end for probably what will be a very interesting discussion. So John, thank you very much for your work on this exhibition, and we all look forward to hearing your interpretation of this.
Thank you, Lucinda. Yes, it's been a lot of fun working on this. And hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to this. I'm going to read my talk. I've just got it in my hand. So if I'm not looking at the camera, if I can't see me, it's because I'm reading. But I wanted to thank Lucinda for all the help she's given us getting this going, and also Bruno Decharme for allowing us to use the photographs that he has. He gave us many more to use than made it into the show. So the title of the talk is Art Without Irony. I'll begin now. When photography was born, it brought with it the promise of truth. Whoops. There. Photographs such as this one, made in 1826 by Nicéphore Niepce, said to be the first photograph in the world, captured what is before it disappeared into the flow of time and forgetfulness. Photographs came to be from the union of light and chemistry, not from a painter's imagination and free will. Reality, the what is, constrained the photographer, unlike the painter. All photography could be seen as documentary, including this, the first selfie ever. Now, however, we know better. The photograph, like every image, is sly. So too, like every image maker, is the photographer. No image carries with it its own truth, not even the photographic image. This we learned from Plato, who lived in a world much like ours, full of images, tempting us with the siren call of truth. The image now on the screen is one of the earliest spirit photos from the 1870s. Some photographers claim to be able to capture the spirit or aura of a dead person, which could be seen only when the photo was developed. Spirit photography owed its popularity in part to the belief that photographs couldn't lie, and also to ignorance of the way a camera functioned. Truth, however, also has many faces and speaks many tongues. Photography, when considered as a fine art, expresses one of those faces if we learn how to read it. Photographers like Robert Frank, Dorothea Lange, and Lee Friedlander have opened our eyes to what is in front of us and have compelled us to look both at the image and the reality it exhibits. In this talk, I will explore some of the attributes of art that is not fine, art brut, and especially that part of it we have called photo brut. The artists in the show create what has also come to be known as outsider art, and so it is reasonable to talk about how they differ from mainstream or fine art creators, the insiders. This, however, can provide only a start, because it would characterize their work negatively, that is, in contrast with other, more easily recognized and accepted art. I will also try to offer some positive descriptions of their work. This is difficult because the creators of art brut and photo brut do not form a school or group, like, say, the Impressionists or the Cubists. They are defined by how they differ from the mainstream and how they differ even from one another. I'll try to pull all this together with examples from the show and elsewhere. What I do not want to claim is that all these artists have something in common. They may have little more in common except their participation in a great, ever-changing web of creations. When I'm finished in about 35 minutes, there will be time for questions and discussion. As I have said, the artists of our show do not belong to any schools of art. What is a school, anyway? I don't know. But it at least means a group of people who have been trained in similar techniques or perhaps have come to work with similar forms. They pay attention to one another's work, visit museums and galleries, talk with one another, perhaps even live near each other in central cities or neighborhoods where the art of their schools is being created. Paris and New York are two such places. The members of a school might also share a sense of what problems need to be addressed in art. Oops. Sorry. For example, Jackson Pollock, one of whose paintings is on the screen, in a 1950 interview responded to the question, what is the meaning of modern art? By saying that modern art is the expression of contemporary aims of the age we are living in. Painters nowadays, he says, do not have to go to a subject matter outside of themselves. Their problem is how to make art its own referent. That is, how to make its subject matter not something external to it or to the artist. This requires, he believes, a new technique to face new artistic challenges in a mechanical world. These techniques can be taught, refined, developed, and changed. By contrast, most of the artists in our show have not gone to art school or learned artistic techniques from a teacher. Most who use photographs do not even own cameras or take their own pictures. Notable exceptions are Mark Hogenkamp and John Brill. They have not been exposed to the methods of making art current in art schools and seem to have no obvious connection with or interest in the art that others are creating or have created. Most mainstream artists seek to display their work in galleries, museums, or private collections. They also try to sell their work to individuals and institutions. We often read about the prices that works bring at auction, as if this were a measure of their excellence as art. Their work is also studied and analyzed in art classes by students seeking art degrees. Students might even try to draw in, say, the Cubist style. That such an attempt makes sense suggests that to belong to a school is to follow certain rules, express similar ideas, and share goals and a sense of what art is about and what it is for. In almost every way in which I have characterized schools of art, the artists of our show, Photo BRUT, outsiders, do not belong to any school. Most have not been trained by others how to draw or paint or make photographs. For example, Lee Godey, or as she sometimes called herself, Lee Godet, because she considered herself a French impressionist, Lee Godey photographs herself in a photo booth, never holding a camera or pressing a shutter release. Her drawings, of which we see one in the show, also defy categorization. Even an artist like Miroslav Tshii, who studied for a while at the Academy of Fine Arts in Prague, cannot be placed in a school or made part of a trend. He gave up painting when the communist regime began requiring artists to work in a realist style. All his equipment was homemade from materials at hand, plywood, sheet metal, cardboard tubes. He even ground his own lenses from plexiglass, which he polished with a mix of toothpaste and cigarette ashes. This is one of his cameras. He said in an interview that I'd seen on YouTube that the way to make a good photograph is, first of all, to start off with a bad camera. Our artists don't visit galleries or museums to apprise themselves of the work of others. Some, like Leopold Strobel, work at the Guggen Gallery near Vienna, a venue affiliated with the former Maria Guging Psychiatric Facility. He sees the work of the other resident artists, but he works alone and doesn't borrow from others or experiment with forms that are not his. None of our artists, at least to my eye, intentionally alludes to great works of the past or present, even if they are familiar with some of them. Nor are most of our artists interested in promoting themselves or selling their work. Henry Darger's drawings and watercolors were discovered only after his death. When we do find these artists displayed in galleries, it is almost always because someone else has taken an interest in their work and promoted it. Our artists never attempt to deceive or mislead, even if we find their works confusing or bewildering. Their use of photographic and other images calls our attention to the fact that they are images, and that they are used to persuade, arouse, inform, or frighten us. An example is this drawing by Curzio di Giovanni, inspired by the magazine photo of a glamorous model and adhered to the back of it. Perhaps if you don't belong to a school, or start one, or imitate one, you forfeit the claim to being considered an artist at all. This is a serious charge, and the question of the place of our makers in the world of art and artists is a vexed one. Perhaps vexed more for us, the viewers, than for the makers, who seem to evidence no interest in ever labeling as art what they create or in calling themselves artists. The title of my talk, Art Without Irony, suggests that another way to distinguish the artists in our show from so-called mainstream or insider artists is the absence of irony in their work. Let me explain what I mean, because it might not be obvious when we talk about art. The word comes from the Greek ironeia, which means dissimulation or feigned ignorance. To be ironic requires that one be aware that art can have two faces or wear two masks. The artist looks to the past and wonders what can be said about it and beyond it. The artist looks to the present to see what his fellows are saying now, and the artist looks to the future to where his or her art is pointing. Sometimes, much of the time perhaps in modern art, what the artist shows us and what they mean are at odds, even contradictory. Now, not all art is ironic, but most insider art, traditional art, art of the schools has the potential to be ironic, to wink at the past or at the taste of the viewer. This potential demands that the artist and her or his art be connected to the world around them and to the art of that world. I'll return to the concept of irony at the end of the talk, after we've had a chance to look carefully at some of the works in our show. Before we do that, however, I'd like to say a few words about the concepts of art brut in general and photo brut in particular, remarks which repeat some of what I have said in my introductory lecture, a link to which can be found on the Mitchell Gallery website. The name art brut was coined by the French painter and sculptor Jean Dubuffet in the late 1940s. He had been influenced by Franz Prinzhorn, a German psychiatrist and art historian, who was one of the first people to take an interest in the artworks of psychiatric patients, not only for their diagnostic and therapeutic value, but also for their artistic merit. These patients were isolated from the mainstream art world. Their independence from the gallery, the collector, and the museum attracted Dubuffet because he found academic art and great painting isolating, mundane, and pretentious. Here is a picture of Dubuffet and one of his own paintings, Summer Guest. The word brut, when used to describe champagne, means something like dry, raw, unrefined. The art that emerged from institutionalized artists, he says, is created from solitude and from pure and authentic creative impulses, where the worries of competition, acclaim, and social promotion do not interfere. He goes on to say that we cannot avoid the feeling that in relation to these works, cultural art in its entirety appears to be the game of a feudal society, a fallacious parade. In 1972, the art critic Roger Cardinal coined the term outsider art, meant to be a translation of art brut. He saw these artists as outside the boundaries of official culture, not simply by being institutionalized, but even by choice or necessity. The two expressions together, along with another that is misleadingly considered their equivalent, visionary art, begin to give us a sense of the realm of this art. Though it does not form a school, as I have emphasized, there are many ways to be outside or brut. Raw photography, or photo brut, includes shots, prints, photo montages, and photo collages created by self-taught artists developed outside conventional art circles in contexts such as mental institutions, solitude, and marginality in both cities and rural areas. Our show consists of images from the collection of Bruno Decharme. These images reflect the work of artists who have used photography or other graphic image reproductions in their work, either in whole or in part. That these works rely on images from the world and not simply from the artist's imaginations suggests that outsider artists are not living solely in a world of their own, but rely on what they find in and make from the objects and people around them. To that extent, brut photography challenges the opinion of some people who have said that outsider artists are separated from their cultures and surroundings. I'm inclined to say that their world is our world, which is dominated by the circulation of images of all kinds. Outsider artists use these images, but the way they use them can produce an unsettling feeling in us. Something uncanny is going on. Our world of images is being transmuted through eyes and minds that perceive something other than what most of us usually do. Let's turn to a few of the artists in the show and consider their works up close. Marcel Bascillard was considered eccentric and antisocial by the citizens of the French town in which he lived, but he was also admired by them. He sometimes went out in broad daylight attired as a woman, wearing dresses that he designed and had custom made. In a letter, he confided, "If I sometimes walk around dressed like a woman, it's because I find this apparel more aesthetic. For the purpose of art, when I put on women's clothing, I take my camera with me and have people I know take snapshots of me." Let's look closely at these two self-portraits by Bascillard and think about them as we look. Both are black and white, with a wide range of brightness, from deep black to shiny white. The one on the left shows Bascillard as if emerging into the light from a background of dark trees and bushes, or perhaps standing in a niche as if he were a statue in a church. His body is bent over and slightly twisted, which makes him appear uncomfortable, as if he wants to get away. But of course, he doesn't want to get away because he has set up this photo shoot. He has dressed for it and asked someone to make this picture of him. Besides, his eyes are looking directly at the camera, at us, without fear or embarrassment. We are also aware, though dimly, of the photographer who is making this picture, the invisible photographer. It is not Bascillard, as we know from his own account, Whoever it is, however, remains unknown, as if to suggest that perhaps we are the ones making the picture. Photos tend to engage us and compel us to dialogue with them. Why? Perhaps we take the photo to be an image of something that existed in the world and which still exists in this image. It is as if we are asked to go up to a person, Marc Bascillard himself. In this photograph, the sheen on his clothing and the way it folds suggests vinyl, in contrast to the cotton or silk in the much earlier photo on the right. His vinyl outfit is accessorized with 2 necklaces. He holds something rectangular in his right hand, perhaps a mirror. This prop appears in most of his self-portraits. What purpose does it serve? Was it for him to be sure his appearance was what he wanted before the photo was made? Or is it a symbol, perhaps a reminder that a photograph of oneself captures permanently what a mirror reflects only fleetingly, and that all photographs do just this? They say to us, this was, and just as you see it. Oh yes, let's not forget the cat near the bottom of the picture. The photograph on the right is a composite. We wonder if the ubiquitous mirror has played a role in the making of this photo, at least in the 2 images on the left. The 3 portraits recede as our eye moves from left to right, almost to a vanishing point, as in traditional perspective painting. He seems not to be wearing the same clothing in all 3 shots. He is sitting, which he rarely does in his pictures. He still looks directly at the camera, or should we say at us? His barely noticeable wry smile issues a challenge to the viewer, as if to say, yes, here I am, a man in woman's clothing. Or maybe not. Maybe he isn't trying to say anything at all. I'd now like to draw our attention to 2 more artists, Elke ten Gaten and Dominik Thiet. They are the same age, born in 1968. Both do their artwork at the S Grand Atelier studio for mentally challenged artists in Belgium. Ten Gaten has always struggled with some slight mental disability, but Thiet was seriously injured in a motorcycle accident just before he was to enter art school. Both begin with images from magazines and other print sources. They are both in this way connected to the world around them because they begin with materials that world provides. In these images, Ten Gaten embroiders onto pictures from 1960s era magazines. Both of these models exude a subdued glamour and self-confidence. What first strikes me about the treatment Ten Gaten gives the pictures is the effect that her embroidery has on the faces of the models. Are those worms or other insects crawling on their faces? Some kind of pockmarks from illness? Why are the woman's hands free of yarn while her face and hair crawl with it? Is the direction in which the yarn is applied vertical, horizontal, diagonal, haphazard, or does it have some sense to it, some aesthetic reason? Notice that in both pictures, Ten Gaten seems to have taken pains to obscure the writing that appears on the magazine page. The way it is obscured in the picture on the right, with red yarn standing out against the flow of beige, seems meant to draw attention to the obscured words. Notice too how the color palette of the yarn echoes and complements that of the clothing that the models wear and their hair. We can say what is going on in these pictures, these works of BRUT photography. Can we likewise say what they mean and judge their aesthetic value? I don't know. But we can begin to wonder if Tangayton is embellishing or mutilating the pictures she works on. The softness of the yarn suggests care and tenderness, while its scar-like appearance says that these pictures need to be damaged. Maybe the works express both tendencies. What depends on how we respond to these suggestions? Dominik Thiet works mostly with pen, which he uses to draw what might be self-portraits onto photographic images from magazines and newspapers. Sometimes he will blot the inked drawing, lift the drawn image from the page, and reproduce it alone. We can see an example here. He seems to use the photographic image as a model, though his ink drawing is not a tracing. Enough difference exists in details to suggest that he is not trying to copy the photo, but to add to it something of himself. For example, the eyeglasses, which Rocky would not be wearing. In another work, we see more or less the same face appear in ink, but are at a loss to see how it connects with the photo image. Does Thiet see a connection, or is the contrast meant to be the connection? Does Thiet care? Should we? Yes, we should try to organize our thoughts and our seeing of these works to determine for ourselves what their center is, what their meaning is. Are the ink drawings an imposition on the original image, a kind of destruction, or a reworking of it to improve it? Or are they a way of inserting the artist into a world from which he is separated? Do they represent longing or revulsion? Once again, as with the questions we raised about Tangayton's weavings, what depends on how we answer these questions? Both Tangayton and Thiet begin with what can be called, perhaps ironically, our world, the world of reproducible photographs, the world of circulating images. Many insider artists have used photos which they comment on in various ways. Andy Warhol is one. His series on Mick Jagger contains many photo prints on which Warhol has drawn. Here is an example. This print is for sale, if you're interested, for $235,000. It contains the signatures of both Warhol and Jagger. Is that price a measure of its artistic value? Do the two signatures deserve to earn a high price? Is it of greater artistic value than one of Dominik Thiet's works? I raise these questions now because in the background has lurked the question of how to judge and value productions on the edge. Can they be judged at all? And if so, by what criteria? I will now raise a few final questions before I close. How do we judge a work of art in general, and the works of our photo BRUT artists in particular? What is the role of the museum, the gallery, the auction house, the collector in determining both artistic and monetary value, and especially in determining who is inside and who outside? Finally, is art BRUT art without irony? Can we answer this question definitively? Jean Dubuffet said that art BRUT artists find in themselves the source of their work. He thought that they offered a fresh look at what art can be when it does not depend on responding to the past, to current trends and pressures, or to the art market. This is an appealing view and seems to tie in with art BRUT's origins in psychiatric facilities, where patients are often said to live in their own worlds. Yet this does not sound exactly right to me. Jackson Pollock said that modern artists work from within, their source is themselves. What separates outsider from insider is that for Pollock, within comes in large part from without, from the artist's interaction with the modern world and with the art of the past and present. The artist's method, he says, grows naturally out of a need, and this need arises from a changing world and the demand it makes on artists. I don't paint nature, I am nature, Pollock memorably said. The within of outsider artists is perhaps less attuned to modern society and to the art that was and is being made. Their within is, we might say, different from that of the insider. The needs which give rise to their individual methods are more personal, as we see, for example, in the cases of Marc Hogenkamp and Pepe Gaitan. But how are we to judge a work of art? I've come to believe that there are some criteria we should not use as final arbiters in our judgment. They find expression in 4 questions. Do I like it? Who made it? Is it good? What does it cost? My liking or not liking a work can be a beginning of a conversation, but is irrelevant to the aesthetic value of the work, just as my liking or not liking a wine cannot measure its value as a wine. What I express when I say that I like a picture by Elga Ten Gaten or Leopold Strobel, or by Jackson Pollock or Andy Warhol or Michelangelo, is simply that I like it. And to wonder whether or not a work of art is good, such as Dominik Thiet's drawing of Rocky, is really to ask 2 questions. Do I like it? And does it satisfy certain criteria? For example, is it well balanced? Does it tell an important story? Does it raise questions the more I look at it? Is it skillfully executed? Rather than ask if the work is good, ask simply if it satisfies criteria. Whether or not the criteria are bedrock on which to evaluate art can be left for another discussion. I will also admit, and if you're like me, you should too, that after my first response to a work, I just must know who made this. A well-known name, or at least one that I recognize, seems to add aesthetic value in my own eyes. But this betrays my uncertainty about my own judgment or taste. The name almost says to me, you ought to like this work and find it good. If you don't, well, that's your problem. But every viewing of a work of art is my problem. That's what can make art stimulating, provocative, and challenging. Every artwork presents itself to me as a problem, and my engagement with it is the journey to a resolution or to more problems. Finally, should we care how much a work of art is selling for these days? I find it very difficult to separate my judgment of a work from its sticker price, in part because, once again, I doubt my own aesthetic sense. I am wowed by a large sum of money. What is significant, however, is that most of the artists in our show haven't made an effort to sell their works. Most were discovered by gallery owners or other art patrons and promoted by these people. It is as if these artists are telling us, don't pay attention to the price when evaluating. We don't. So how do we make judgment about the works of Photo BRUT? I can only suggest that we start talking about them one by one and see if our conversation gets anywhere. A question we sometimes ask about a book at St. John's when discussing if it should have a place on the program is whether or not it leads to fruitful discussion. This criterion is fraught with vagueness, I know, but I will pass that by. Can you talk about it? And perhaps as important, can you learn to talk about it more and help others do the same? If so, we're getting somewhere. What about the works in our show? How do you feel about them? What makes BRUT art difficult to judge is that the background of art history, art techniques, trends, and schools is missing from their work. They are not addressing the problems that Pollock proposes. They are not developing techniques that are improvements or offshoots of what other artists are using. It feels as if they are sometimes speaking languages that need decoding, but there is no Rosetta Stone to help guide us. Perhaps, however, we have been seduced by a false distinction, insider, outsider, fine art, art brut. Doesn't there exist a complex continuum of makers of images and objects at any point on which we can raise questions like those we have raised for the creators in our show? Folk art, visionary art, kitsch, bad art and good, and on and on. Let's be wary of any distinctions in the realm of human creative productions. Let's not be glib, as I may have been today, in sorting through and categorizing the imaginative products of what we call art. This will, I fear, only make the estimation and judging of these works more difficult, but at least it will be more honest. Having said that, I would still like to consider the absence of irony as a defining feature of the artists in the Mitchell Gallery show. Irony requires that there be a distance between the artist and the work. This distance allows the artist to turn one eye to the work and one to the audience. Perhaps this distance is the crux of the potential for irony in art, as in these self-portraits, as in this self-portrait by insider Cindy Sherman. Compare it with these by Marc Bascillard. There is an inherent irony in the visual image which both is and is not what it seems. Our brute artists, I suggest, undermine this ironic attraction of the photographic image to unearth a genuineness that often escapes the photographer. To the degree that our outsiders, our brute artists, are not connected to their world, they cannot be ironic. That is, their work is always genuine, with no distance between it and the maker. As I've said, most of the artists in our show don't consider what they are doing art at all. They are doing what they must do, and they do not, cannot separate themselves from the doing or its product. Their art is not an interpretation. They do not see something as something else. They see what is and present it as they see it. This is why they bewilder, excite, confuse, and challenge us. So this brings my curator's talk to a close. Thank you for attending. Thanks also to Bruno Decharme for allowing us to use works from his vast collection of photo brut. Thanks to Lucinda Edinburgh, acting director of the Mitchell Gallery, who has given both the show and me a sense of stability, purpose, and progress from the moment we thought we could pull together a show like this. Thanks also to Matt Link and Jennifer Donnelly for their helpful suggestions on the talk. Both of them helped me see more of the artists in the show than I could have seen on my own. Thanks also to Jennifer Behrens and Sally McGee of the St. John's Information Office and Asal Janabi of our IT office, without whom this show would not have been possible. Now for your questions and observations.
John, we got a question, and this is one that I had to actually ask, but we got a question about what drew you into this particular kind of art.
I should latch on to a nice image here. I've always been interested in psychology, and the one attraction, in a sense, was that when I saw this exhibit at the American Folk Art Museum last year, and also when I participated in some of their webinars, even before I saw the show, I really had no handle on how to look at it as one show. Often in a museum, you go into a room and here are the impressionists, and while one can't really put them all together in one basket, still you begin to see similarities. You know, so-and-so knew so-and-so. They worked in Paris but these people were all over the place. Each one seemed to be an individual. And besides that, their work often simply lacked what you might call fine technique. And so I was very curious why this was considered art, what was going on here. And then finally, as I dug into it a little bit more and saw that the interest in it kind of emerged from the origin in psychiatric facilities and my own interest in psychology and what people who are mentally distressed can provide for us, or what we can provide for ourselves sometimes in dreams and other states, just really got me interested. I'm not sure I'm much farther along. And these artists are active. There are many of them active all over the world. And they all seem to be producing work that is, unique is not a good word because it makes them sound like they're magicians or they come from another planet. But in a sense, they come from the edge. And I think there's a lot to learn about what is inside, about what you might call fine art, by going to the edge and looking at these people. Anyway, so my interest is partly from an interest in art, largely an interest in photography, and even more so an interest in psychology, which has been longstanding.
We have a question here. How does one differentiate between significant and insignificant art, BRUT? You know, what is significance in art? Ooh, that's a big question.
Yeah. Well, I'll give an example. I think. Let me see if I can do that. I'll go back to Bascillard. I should say something about his life. One significant moment in his life was when he was a teenager. His mother murdered his father. Now, I don't know if that's significant in his life. I'm not sure if it's significant in his art. He himself was murdered eventually, for reasons that are not all that clear. But my first impression was of something uncanny in what he was doing. Not simply dressing as a woman, but designing his own clothing, looking directly into the camera, setting up all of these. He seemed to know what he was doing, but it was really difficult to get at. The more I viewed him, the more I thought, and this is not really fair, the more I thought that of the artists in the show, there's something even more, there's something special about what he's doing. I can begin to get a sense, I can begin to want to look at more and more of his work. So that's one way into how does one judge? Do I want to see more? Do I want to see more of Elke Tanguiten's weavings? Let's see if I can find where she is.
John, this says significance is tied. Significance is tied to confidence and technique.
Well, I don't know how. I don't know. That's a good possibility. I don't know. Bascillard at least kind of exudes an air of confidence, but not just in technique, but self-confidence by looking at the camera, this slight smile that he has walking around town dressed in women's clothing. Although he only put on women's clothing when he wanted to have photographs made of him. It wasn't something he did all the time. Mm. So there is a confidence there, but I think still it goes back to what I was suggesting late in the talk. Can we keep a conversation about the works going? Do I want to see more? So Elke Tanguiten came upon this method. She did other things at the facility in Belgium that she was working at. She did other things, And then she came upon this, and for the last, I don't know, 10 years or so, this is all she's done. Do I want to see more and more? Well, for me anyway, to want to see more means I need to be able to talk about what's in front of me in a kind of fruitful way, or a way that raises questions that maybe other works can help address. If her work turns out to be repetitive and I can't really say much about it, then if I'm judging these or trying to make a hierarchy, I guess I would, she would begin to slip down in that hierarchy. So that's just a way of using the one criterion that I feel a little comfortable with is, can we continue to talk about this artist, about the work, and do I want to see more of what the artist has done? And I think, we can apply that also with works of fine art too. Can I keep talking about a work, and do I want to see more of the artist's works? So I don't know about how to judge, but I don't think that, for example, a way not to judge these artists is by what they have done to change what other artists have been doing, right? So the move from Impressionism to Neo-Impressionism, they're not looking anywhere else. And because there's no background, this is what struck me at first, is there is no background against which I can talk about what they're doing. And we have to realize that so often we bring to our looking at works of art a background, even if we can't express it ourselves. Struck with these people, almost all of them, not entirely all of them, but almost all of them, we don't find that background. And even Jackson Pollock, as whatever you think about him, certainly comes from his past. Problems arose for him from work that was being done, and he found what he thought was a solution. I don't think these people, they're working maybe on problems, but they're not coming from what other people have done. They're coming from somewhere else. And it's that somewhere else that I find remarkably interesting.
And John, there's a good follow-up question, I think, that dovetails with what you've just said. And someone said, is there a continuum from the artist who works only for themselves, moving along to those artists who want to communicate more with the viewer and ultimately buy their work?
Yeah, no, that's very good. So I'll give it one example. Henry Darger. Henry Darger wrote The Vivian Girls. He wrote this enormously long book. I think I point out in my introductory lecture that it has more pages than there are lines in the Odyssey. And it's a fantastical story. I won't even go into what it's about. I don't think I'll have time before I die to read it, but he never showed it to anyone. He lived in a small apartment in Chicago. He went to church every day and worked as a janitor in a Catholic hospital there. And he worked on his book, a couple of books like that, and watercolors that were associated with them. And the watercolors, he took many of the images, he copied images from comic books and other kind of printed media. So Darger was someone who had no interest in even showing his work to anyone. When he died and his landlords discovered this, they thought they were onto something. In fact, the issue of who owns his work and who should profit from the sale of it is current right now in the courts now. And Darger died, I'll get this wrong, but Darger's been dead for 30 years. I think he died in the 80s, mid 80s. Anyway, so he's someone who had no interest at all. I don't think someone like Elke Tangaten, I don't know, she works in a studio with other people, and there are probably people supervising their work. And Lee Godey is another one who promoted her work. And how did she do that? Well, she also has an interesting history, but But eventually she ended up on the street in Chicago and would sell her drawings outside the Art Institute of Chicago. And if she liked your face or liked the way you look, she would unfurl a drawing and show it to you and ask if you would buy it. So she was promoting her work. In the meantime, as an add-on to her drawings, she would take pictures of herself in a photo booth at the Greyhound bus terminal. That's why I said some people don't even touch a camera. So she was promoting her work, but in this kind of slant way on the street. And by the way, going back to Darger before I forget, so Darger's works now sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Again, I don't want to go into that, really into the topic of the monetary value, because I think he's been dead. He didn't promote himself. He's being promoted by others, and exactly why his work commands that kind of money, I really couldn't say, but he had no interest in it. Why did they do it? Those who had no interest even in showing their work, and maybe, who knows, how much work was destroyed by the artists without anybody even knowing. What were they doing? Well, Mark Hogenkamp is a good example. He's also he's in the show, and I talk about him in the other talk. Mark Hogenkamp, after he was brutally beaten when he was in his late 30s, was unconscious in a coma for a week or so, lost his memory, and began to use 1/6 size dolls to create a world of a town, a Belgian town in World War II, which he then would photograph, and he would make up stories connected with that. And he never promoted himself. He also was discovered by a gallery owner who has promoted him, but he says he does this because it's his therapy. He has no other reason for doing it. He's become somewhat well-known, but he still works. He's about 60 years old. He still works, takes the photos, develops the story of this Marwin Call. And by the way, Marwin Call is the book we're going to be reading in our book club next week. So it's a mixed bag why they do it. And the other reason why some of them do it and never promote their work or show it to others, because they have to do it. That's what they do. That's just what they do. And that's not an explanation. It doesn't shed much light on the why, but it does, for me at least, make me want to try to understand them better, understand the work better. Now, saying all of that, I'll just simply say some of the stuff that's in our show, I have no idea what to do with. I'm sorry. I wish I did. I wish I knew what to think or how to respond to. But each artist presents some brand new challenge. And that's what I find very fascinating. Even the order in which we put them in the show, they're kind of grouped into categories, perfectly artificial categories. It's not as if going through the show, you're going from better to worse or worse to better, anything like that. So yeah, anyway, yeah.
And John is a relatively new photographer yourself. Have you, because you don't follow really in the academic tradition of art, you certainly follow in the academic tradition of education, but do you think these works have influenced your view of photography?
They have, some of them have, in a couple of ways. Well, since we have Elke ten Gaten right here on the screen, one thing that these artists have made me more aware of is just the flood of of photographic images in our society. Just create, and so one has to think, what is a photographic image? Why isn't it like, say, an etching or a print that can be also reproduced many times? Well, then I began to think, well, what is the photograph? And the photograph is different from, it's just different from, say, a painting or a drawing, because the photograph seems to, at least, gives us the impression that it is receptive. It comes from, that the camera itself is a receptive instrument. It's passive. And so what comes out in the photograph has to have been there. And it carries with it a sense of, or at least the possibility of, reality in a way that paintings and drawings don't. So yes, I've begun to think about the place of the photograph that way, in the wider place of these kinds of images in society. Now everybody is a photographer. Being a photographer doesn't mean anything. It just means having an iPhone or any kind of phone, and people take, well, I don't want to say they take good pictures, because I don't know yet what that means. But what can be done with these images too? That's why I keep Tangaten here on the screen. What can be done with the image is also very interesting. It can be mutilated, or it can be lovingly embroidered. Yeah, so yeah, it has. But again, these the BRUT artists are so widely different. And then I was a little surprised that I should have known about Warhol's 17 print series on Mick Jagger, but I didn't. And we actually saw a couple. We saw a few of them at the museum at West Virginia University of West Virginia in Morgantown just a couple of weeks ago. But that he too would take those images and just draw on them, just the way Dominik Thiet does. And I was kind of blown away by that parallel. I doubt that Thiet knew anything about Warhol. I don't know, but one can begin with an image and then do something to it. The image is not the last word. This is not anything, it's not really anything new, but the thought that one might take a painting, take a Picasso or take a Michelangelo and make it better by embroidering on it, by piercing the canvas and doing what Elke Tangaten does, that doesn't really, for some reason, that doesn't make sense. One wouldn't go about doing that to paintings with the idea of improving them, or, yeah.
Well, just as a little factoid, Warhol got sued. He did similar things of John Wayne and got sued, for by other people for using the images, and repurposing them without their permissions. And I thinking about with the cell phone, it makes me wonder if these artists, and I'm sure now artists are using the cell phone, but it makes me wonder, like, would Bascillard have taken his own photographs if he had the cell phone? I mean, and how that would have it changed or not? He couldn't have done the full shots, I suppose, but or Lee Godey, she was able to do it herself. It may not have changed, and maybe it's part of that interaction of not having your finger on the shutter.
Which is exactly right with Bascillard and Lee Godey both. Neither of them. Now, Bascillard had a camera, but not in his hands. He wasn't, in a sense, he wasn't the photographer, but he is the photographer, I guess. And Lee Godey is in the same. She doesn't do anything except sit in the photo booth and present herself to the passive machine. That's the other thing that occurs to me about photography, is that the camera is a machine, and when we're talking about film, of course, it works through chemistry. And just that whole connection of the machine to what the machine produces, namely the photograph, I find to be especially fitting for our world. And I think that's part of what Pollock was getting at too, although he was talking from the point of view of painting. We live in a mechanical world, and it presents certain kinds of problems. Does it also present the solutions? That is the camera both the problem and the solution. Is the camera, did the camera raise the problems that allowed these artists to work on the problems that were produced by this mechanism? All of that is, it's kind of off, a little bit off the subject, but yeah.
And well, and someone, Karen wrote, Bascillard brings to mind Cindy Sherman's work. She creates settings and becomes the subject, but vanishes into the image.
Right. Yeah, she's very interesting, I think. She's definitely what you'd call an insider, and has this long history, and she's still producing all kinds of stuff, but a long history of making herself into an image from a movie, from Hollywood movies, not exactly always looking like someone, but looking like a character, like a genre character. And when you compare, say, these two with Cindy Sherman with these by Bascillard, I don't know, if you want to ask the question, which is better, I really can't say. They're up to different things, mainly they're doing different things. But she also, she doesn't have the camera in her hand, or she doesn't have a remote, unless she's hiding it somewhere. She set this up. Maybe someone else is taking the picture. I'm not sure how she did it. It's almost secondary, really. It's funny because the photographer we always think of as having the camera and taking the pictures with his or her hands, but it's almost secondary who runs the machine.
And so she says, and yes, at one time, Avedon told me that the picture took itself, although he snapped the image.
Mm-hmm. And I'm tempted sometimes to think that with the advent of digital photography, lots of things change, and in some ways they do change, but that is the kind of passivity that that photography, the camera, presented for so long. That is the image on the film. Not all that much one could do with the film. There was stuff you could do in the darkroom. Seems to have melted away into the enormous, this plethora of changes that one can make to the given image through Photoshop and other sort of digital means. But there's something still fundamentally given to the photographer by the world. And I think that's what's important about these images, that you begin with something real, something that exists outside.
Well, John, thank you so much for your work on this. I mean, this has really been a labor of love. And also to Jennifer Donnelly, she's really, she's an Annapolis alum who has really been in the shadows and doing lots of editing and writing, and we really appreciate her works. And St. John's College community, overall on the back end of all of this. And of course, to Bruno Decharme and to his assistant, Nicholas, we are just really appreciative that we've been able to pull this off online. So the book club will meet. You can register online. If you've got the book, Welcome to Marwin Call. It's an amazing book. John picked this out, and it's just hard to believe that, these are action dolls and Barbies that he's created in his backyard to create this World War II imaginary town of Marwin Call. So it's a quick read in many respects because it's lots of pictures. So I know we'll have a lively discussion. So thank you once again. Have a lovely evening, and contact me if you have questions about getting the book, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks again, John.
All right. Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.
Good night.